before you try another diet, cut carbs again, or start doing hours of cardio. There's something really important you need to understand. Apple cider vinegar isn't magic, but it does something very specific in your body that most people completely miss. You've probably heard people say, take apple cider vinegar and you'll lose weight, but they don't explain why. And if you don't understand the mechanism, you're just guessing, and guessing doesn't get consistent results. So let's break this down in a simple way. The real reason apple cider vinegar helps with weight loss has to do with your blood sugar and insulin. And if you don't control insulin, you will struggle to burn fat no matter how healthy your diet looks. Every time you eat, especially carbs, your blood sugar goes up. When blood sugar goes up, your body releases insulin. Insulin's job is to lower blood sugar by pushing it into your cells. But here's the problem. Insulin is also a fat storage hormone. When insulin is high, your body is in fat storing mode, not fat burning mode. Now, this is where apple cider vinegar comes in. Apple cider vinegar helps improve something called insulin sensitivity. That means your body needs less insulin to handle the same amount of sugar. Lower insulin levels make it easier for your body to access stored fat and burn it. There's also another effect. Apple cider vinegar slows down how fast food leaves your stomach. This is called delayed gastric emptying. What that means for you is you feel full longer, you snack less, and your blood sugar rises more gradually instead of spiking. When you prevent those spikes, you also prevent crashes. And when you prevent crashes, you reduce cravings, especially for sugar and refined carbs. Now think about this. If you're constantly craving food, constantly snacking, and constantly spiking insulin, your body never gets the chance to burn fat. So apple cider vinegar isn't directly burning fat. What it's doing is creating the internal conditions where fat burning becomes possible. Another important factor is digestion. Apple cider vinegar contains acetic acid, which can help increase stomach acidity. Many people actually have low stomach acid, especially as they get older. When your stomach acid is low, you don't break down protein efficiently, and that can lead to bloating, poor nutrient absorption, and even more cravings. When digestion improves, your body gets the nutrients it needs, and that naturally reduces the urge to overeat. There's also a connection with the liver. Your liver plays a key role in metabolism and fat burning. Apple cider vinegar may help support liver function indirectly by stabilizing blood sugar and reducing the burden caused by excess sugar and insulin spikes. Now, here's something practical. If you're going to use apple cider vinegar, the timing matters. Taking it before meals, especially meals that contain carbs, can help reduce the blood sugar spike from that meal. To 2 tablespoons diluted in a glass of water before eating. Not straight, always dilute it to protect your teeth and throat. Consistency is key. This isn't something you take once and expect a miracle. It works gradually by improving how your body responds to food. But here's the part most people ignore. Apple cider vinegar works best when combined with a low-carb or reduced sugar diet. If you're taking it but still eating a lot of refined carbs and sugar, you're working against yourself. Think of it as a tool, not a solution by itself. Also, if your goal is weight loss, you need to create an environment where insulin stays relatively low throughout the day. That means fewer snacks, more time between meals, and focusing on whole foods instead of processed ones. Apple cider vinegar can support that process by helping control appetite, stabilizing blood sugar, and improving digestion. And one more thing, quality matters. Look for raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar with the mother. That's where many of the beneficial compounds are found. So the next time you hear someone say apple cider vinegar helps with weight loss, you'll know the real reason. It helps regulate insulin, stabilize blood sugar, and reduce cravings, making it easier for your body to actually burn fat. This is the same principle often explained by Dr. Eric Berg, focusing on how hormones, especially insulin, control whether your body stores fat or burns it. Once you understand that, everything starts to make a lot more sense. When you look at weight loss from the outside, most people think it's just about eating eating less or exercising more, but inside the body, the real control system is much more specific, and it revolves heavily around insulin and how your cells respond to it, because insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone, it is the main storage hormone that decides whether energy is burned or stored. And when insulin is constantly high, fat loss becomes extremely difficult, even if you are eating healthy foods or controlling calories. And this is where apple cider vinegar becomes interesting, because it does not act like a fat burner in the direct sense. It works more like a metabolic signal modifier that helps your body respond better to carbohydrates and reduces the intensity of the insulin response after meals when you eat carbohydrates like bread, rice, sugar, or even fruit in excess. Your digestive system breaks them down into glucose, and that glucose enters your bloodstream, and as soon as that happens, your pancreas releases insulin to manage that glucose. And insulin's job is to take sugar out of the blood and move it into cells. But when there is too much frequent glucose coming in, insulin keeps getting triggered again and again, and over time your cells can become less responsive to it, which is what people refer to as insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is not just a blood sugar issue, it is fundamentally a fat storage issue. The body is essentially in a storage state, meaning fat burning is paused and fat storage is prioritized. Now, apple cider vinegar interacts with this process in a very specific way, mainly through acetic acid, which has been shown to influence how quickly carbohydrates are absorbed and how strongly blood sugar rises after meals. So instead of a sharp spike in glucose that triggers a strong insulin response, the rise becomes more gradual, and that smaller insulin response is important because insulin is dose dependent, meaning the higher the spike, the more insulin your body has to release, and the more insulin stays elevated, the more your body is locked out of burning stored fat for energy. So by smoothing out the glucose curve, apple cider vinegar indirectly lowers the insulin load on the system at the same time. There is also an effect on something called insulin sensitivity, which is how well your cells respond to insulin when it is present. And when insulin sensitivity is improved, your body does not need to produce as much insulin to manage the same amount of glucose. And this is a major shift, because lower insulin demand means shorter time spent in a fat-storing hormonal state and longer potential windows where fat burning can occur, especially between meals or during fasting periods. And this is why people who already follow lower carbohydrate eating patterns tend to notice more consistent benefits from apple cider vinegar, because their insulin levels are already lower. So any additional improvement in sensitivity has a more noticeable effect. Another important layer is how apple cider vinegar affects the liver's handling of glucose, because after carbohydrates are absorbed, the liver plays a major role in deciding whether that glucose is stored as glycogen or converted into fat when glycogen stores are full. And when insulin levels are repeatedly high, the liver is pushed toward converting more excess energy into fat storage, especially in the abdominal area. But when insulin signaling becomes more efficient, the liver is not under the same constant storage pressure, and metabolic flexibility improves, meaning the body can switch more easily between using glucose and using stored fat for energy depending on availability. There is also a gastrointestinal component that indirectly ties into insulin response, because the speed at which food leaves the stomach, known as gastric emptying, influences how fast glucose enters the bloodstream, and apple cider vinegar slows this process slightly. So instead of a rapid influx of glucose, there is a slower, more controlled release, and this gives the pancreas a more manageable workload, reducing the likelihood of sharp insulin peaks that are typically followed by crashes in blood sugar that lead to fatigue and cravings. Those cravings are not random. They are often driven by unstable glucose and insulin cycles, because when blood sugar drops too quickly after a spike, the brain interprets that as an energy shortage and increases hunger signals, especially for quick energy foods like sugar and refined carbs. So when apple cider vinegar helps stabilize that cycle, appetite regulation improves naturally without needing willpower-based control. And this is where people start to notice they are not thinking about food as frequently between meals on a cellular level. There is also ongoing research suggesting that acetic acid may influence enzyme activity related to fat metabolism, including pathways that help increase fat oxidation, meaning the body becomes slightly more efficient at using stored fat as fuel when energy intake is lower. But this effect is still secondary compared to the main mechanism, which is insulin regulation, because insulin is still the primary switch that determines whether fat burning is even allowed to happen in the first place. When insulin is high, hormone-sensitive lipase, which is responsible for releasing stored fat from fat cells. Even if your body needs energy, it cannot easily access fat stores, but when insulin levels are reduced and insulin sensitivity improves, that enzyme activity is less suppressed, allowing stored triglycerides to be broken down into fatty acids and used for energy more efficiently. And this shift is not immediate in the sense of a quick fat loss effect, but it creates a metabolic environment where fat loss becomes progressively easier over time, as long as dietary inputs are not constantly overriding the system. And this is also where consistency becomes important, because apple cider vinegar is not acting like a stimulant or a short-term metabolic boost. It is acting more like a regulator of post-meal physiology, meaning its effects accumulate over repeated meals, especially when taken before carbohydrate-containing foods. And over time, those repeated smaller insulin responses can gradually improve overall insulin dynamics in the body, especially when combined with other habits. Reduce insulin load, such as spacing meals further apart and reducing processed carbohydrate intake. What makes this particularly relevant is that many people struggling with weight loss are not necessarily overeating in extreme amounts, but they are staying in a chronically elevated insulin environment due to frequent eating, snacking, and high refined carbohydrate intake. And in that state, fat loss becomes hormonally suppressed regardless of calorie counting efforts, because the hormonal environment is signaling storage rather than release. And apple cider vinegar simply helps soften that signal at the meal level, especially in response to carbohydrates that would otherwise trigger a stronger insulin spike. And when you begin stacking those small improvements across multiple meals per day, the overall metabolic picture begins to shift in a way that gradually supports easier access to stored energy and a more stable appetite pattern that continues developing when insulin no longer constantly exaggerated, and the body starts to move into a more balanced energy handling state where glucose is managed more smoothly and fat oxidation can gradually become more available in the background as insulin demand continues to stabilize and the system adjusts to a lower fluctuation state where energy availability becomes less dependent on frequent intake and more dependent on stored energy access, which starts to open up when insulin signaling is no longer constantly elevated across the day. And stabilizing blood sugar is often underestimated because most people think weight loss is only about calories or exercise, but the timing and speed of digestion has a major impact on how your hormones respond to food, especially insulin. And when you understand this process, you begin to see why some people feel hungry shortly after eating, while others stay full for hours, even after similar meals, because the difference is not only what they eat, but how quickly that food is processed and absorbed into the bloodstream. And apple cider vinegar plays a role in moderating that speed in a very specific physiological way. When you eat a meal, especially one containing carbohydrates, your stomach begins breaking it down into smaller components, and then it passes into the small intestine where glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream. But this process is not fixed. It can happen faster or slower depending on several factors such as fiber content, fat content, protein content, and digestive enzyme activity. And when digestion happens too quickly, glucose enters the blood rapidly, creating a sharp rise in blood sugar. And that sharp rise forces the pancreas to release a larger amount of insulin to manage it. And that insulin spike is often followed by a rapid drop in blood sugar, which is what triggers fatigue, cravings, and hunger shortly after eating apple cider vinegar helps slow this entire process down through its acetic acid content, which has been shown to delay gastric emptying, meaning food stays in the stomach longer before moving into the small intestine. And this slower movement has a cascading effect on the entire metabolic response, because when nutrients are released more gradually, again, the pancreas does not need to release a large surge of insulin all at once. Instead, it releases a smaller, more controlled amount over a longer period, which helps maintain more stable blood sugar levels. This stability is extremely important because blood sugar is tightly connected to appetite regulation in the brain, especially in the hypothalamus, which monitors energy availability and sends signals related to hunger and fullness. And when blood sugar rises and falls sharply, the brain interprets those fluctuations as instability in energy supply, which often leads to increased hunger signals even when enough calories have been consumed. When blood sugar remains more stable due to slower digestion, those hunger signals become less frequent and less intense, allowing natural appetite regulation to function more effectively without constant cravings. Another important aspect is how slower digestion affects insulin timing, because insulin is not only released in response to the amount of glucose, but also the speed at which glucose appears in the blood. So when digestion is slowed, insulin is released in a more gradual curve instead of a sharp spike. And this matters because insulin is not just a glucose control hormone, it is also a storage signal. And the longer insulin remains elevated at high levels, the more the body remains in a storage-oriented state rather than a fat-burning state. So smoothing out that insulin curve helps reduce the amount of time the body spends locked in fat storage mode after meals. There is also a mechanical aspect in the stomach itself, because apple cider vinegar increases the acidity of gastric contents, and this can improve the breakdown of proteins and fats in the stomach, which in turn influences how quickly food leaves the stomach, because properly broken down food is released at a more controlled rate. And when digestion is more efficient in the stomach phase, it reduces the burden on the small intestine and prevents sudden nutrient overload that would otherwise trigger rapid absorption and hormonal spikes. In addition to this, the presence of acetic acid may also influence enzymes involved in carbohydrate digestion, slightly reducing the rate at which starches are converted into glucose, which again contributes to a slower rise in blood sugar. And this is especially relevant in modern diets where refined carbohydrates are consumed frequently, because refined carbs are already rapidly digestible. So any mechanism that slows their absorption can have a noticeable impact on post-meal energy stability. When blood sugar rises slowly instead of rapidly, the body also avoids the reactive hypoglycemia that often follows a spike, which is when insulin overshoots and brings blood sugar down too quickly. And that drop in blood sugar is one of the main triggers for sugar cravings, irritability, and energy crashes. So by preventing the initial spike, apple cider vinegar indirectly prevents the crash that follows, creating a smoother energy curve throughout the day, which reduces the need for frequent snacking and helps people naturally extend the time between meals without feeling uncomfortable hunger. This extended satiety effect is also related to the way stomach emptying influences satiety hormones, because hormones like GLP-1 and peptide YY are involved in signaling fullness to the brain. And these hormones are released more effectively when food is digested and absorbed at a steady rate rather than rapidly. So by slowing digestion, apple cider vinegar supports a more sustained release of fullness signals, which contributes to reduced overall calorie intake without conscious restriction. There is also a behavioral impact that comes from this physiological change, because when people experience fewer cravings and longer lasting fullness, they are less likely to engage in impulsive eating or emotional snacking. And over time, this leads to a more stable eating pattern, which indirectly supports fat loss simply by reducing unnecessary energy intake. But the key driver is not willpower, it is hormonal stability created by smoother digestion and blood sugar regulation. Another important important point is how this mechanism interacts with insulin sensitivity over time, because repeated high spikes in blood sugar and insulin can gradually reduce cellular responsiveness, but when those spikes are consistently moderated, the body experiences less metabolic stress, and this can support improved insulin signaling efficiency, which further reinforces the ability to maintain stable blood sugar levels in future meals, creating a feedback loop where meal becomes slightly more metabolically efficient than the last when the pattern is maintained consistently. Even hydration and satiety perception are influenced indirectly, because slower digestion allows for better nutrient absorption timing, and when nutrients are absorbed gradually, the body has more time to recognize energy availability, which reduces the mismatch between calorie intake and satiety signaling that often occurs with fast digesting meals where calories are consumed quickly but fullness signals lag behind, leading to overeating before the brain registers sufficient intake. All of this combines into a single central effect, which is reduced volatility in post-meal metabolism, meaning fewer extreme highs and lows in blood sugar, insulin, and appetite. And that stability is one of the most important foundations for sustainable weight management, because when the body is not constantly oscillating between energy surplus and perceived energy shortage, it becomes easier to maintain consistent eating habits and naturally reduce excess intake without forced restriction. And apple cider vinegar contributes to this by acting on the timing and pace of digestion in a way that subtly reshapes the hormonal response to food intake over repeated use and consistent dietary patterns, where carbohydrate handling becomes more controlled and energy release becomes more gradual across the entire post-meal window, supporting a more balanced metabolic rhythm that reduces unnecessary spikes and improves overall appetite regulation throughout the day. Apple cider vinegar's role in slowing digestion and stabilizing blood sugar is often misunderstood, because people tend to focus only on what a food does in terms of calories or nutrients, but the real impact happens in the timing of digestion and how that timing affects hormonal responses, especially insulin and appetite-related signals. And when digestion is too fast, the body experiences rapid fluctuations in sugar that create a chain reaction of metabolic instability, which is one of the hidden drivers of cravings, overeating, and energy crashes throughout the day. While apple cider vinegar works more subtly by influencing how quickly food moves through the stomach and how gradually nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream. When you consume a meal containing carbohydrates, those carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and absorbed into the bloodstream, but the speed of that absorption is not fixed and can vary depending on digestion speed. And when digestion is rapid, glucose enters the blood in a sharp wave, which forces the pancreas to release a strong insulin response, and insulin then rapidly clears glucose from the bloodstream by pushing it into cells. But when this happens too aggressively, blood sugar can drop too quickly afterward, leading to a rebound hunger response that feels like sudden cravings or low energy, even though the body has already received sufficient calories. And this cycle of spike and crash is one of the main reasons people struggle with constant hunger despite eating regular meals. Apple cider vinegar introduces acetic acid into this process, and acetic acid slows gastric emptying, meaning food remains in the stomach for a longer period before passing into the small intestine. And this delay is not harmful, but rather regulatory, because it allows the body to process nutrients in a more controlled manner. And when food leaves the stomach more gradually, glucose enters the bloodstream at a slower and steadier rate, which reduces the intensity of the insulin response. And this smoother curve is important because insulin is highly sensitive to the rate of glucose entry, not just the total amount consumed. So even the same meal can produce very different hormonal responses depending on how fast it is digested. This slower digestion has a direct effect on satiety, because fullness is not just a mechanical feeling of a full stomach, it is also a hormonal signal driven by several gut hormones that respond to nutrient flow. And when nutrients are released steadily, Hormones like GLP-1 and peptide BY are released in a more sustained pattern, which sends stronger and longer lasting signals of fullness to the brain, reducing the likelihood of early hunger after eating, whereas fast digestion tends to produce a short-lived satiety response followed by a rapid decline, which often leads to repeated eating within short intervals. Blood sugar stability is another major outcome of this slower digestion process, because when glucose enters the bloodstream gradually, the body avoids the sharp peaks and drops that disrupt energy balance, and stable blood sugar is critical for maintaining steady cognitive function, mood stability, and appetite control, because the brain is highly dependent on glucose as a fuel source, and when levels fluctuate too quickly, it interprets those changes as instability in energy responses and increased food-seeking behavior, especially for quick energy sources like sugar and refined carbohydrates. The slowing of digestion also affects insulin timing in a meaningful way, because insulin release is not only triggered by the presence of glucose, but also by how quickly glucose levels rise. So when digestion is slowed, insulin is released more gradually and remains at lower peaks, which reduces the time the body spends in a high insulin state. And this is important because elevated insulin not only regulates blood sugar, but also suppresses fat breakdown, meaning that when insulin is high, fat storage is favored and fat release is inhibited. So reducing insulin spikes through slower digestion creates more opportunities for the body to access stored fat between meals. Another important factor is that apple cider vinegar may slightly increase stomach acidity, and this improved acidity helps break down proteins more efficiently, which contributes to better overall digestion and reduces the likelihood of undigested food moving too quickly into the intestines, where it would otherwise trigger rapid absorption and hormonal fluctuations. And when protein digestion is improved, it also supports more stable satiety signals, because protein is one of the strongest contributors to fullness hormone release. So better digestion of protein can indirectly enhance appetite control. There is also an effect on carbohydrate breakdown enzymes, because acetic acid may influence the activity of enzymes involved in starch digestion, slightly slowing the conversion of starch into glucose, and this contributes to a more controlled glycemic response after meals, especially in diets that include refined carbohydrates, where glucose would normally be released very quickly. And by moderating this release, apple cider vinegar reduces the metabolic stress associated with frequent glucose spikes, which over time can contribute to improved insulin sensitivity. Overall metabolic regulation: when blood sugar rises slowly instead of rapidly, the likelihood of reactive hypoglycemia decreases. And this is important because reactive hypoglycemia is one of the most common triggers of mid-meal cravings and emotional eating, since the brain responds strongly to drops in glucose availability by increasing hunger signals. And when these drops are minimized, the brain receives a more stable energy signal, which reduces the urgency of eating and allows for longer natural fasting periods between meals without discomfort. This also influences behavioral eating patterns, because when people experience fewer fluctuations in hunger and energy, they tend to make more consistent food choices and are less likely to engage in impulsive eating driven by sudden cravings. And over time, this leads to a more stable calorie intake pattern without requiring strict restriction, because appetite regulation becomes more physiologically balanced rather than emotionally driven. Another subtle but important effect is the improvement in nutrient absorption timing, because when digestion is slowed and more controlled, nutrients are absorbed in a more synchronized manner, allowing the body to utilize energy more efficiently without overwhelming metabolic pathways. And this reduces the mismatch between intake and utilization that often occurs with rapid digestion, where energy floods into the bloodstream faster than it can be effectively used or stored in a balanced way over repeated use. This slower digestion pattern can also contribute to improved metabolic flexibility, which is the body's ability to switch between using using carbohydrates and fats as fuel depending on availability. Because when glucose spikes are reduced, insulin levels remain lower more consistently, and lower insulin allows fat oxidation to occur more freely between meals, creating a metabolic environment where the body is not constantly locked into glucose dependence, into a single consistent outcome, which is reduced volatility in post-meal metabolic response, meaning fewer extreme highs and lows in blood sugar, insulin, and appetite signals. And this stability is one of the most important foundations for natural weight regulation, because when the body is not constantly reacting to rapid changes in energy availability, it can maintain a more balanced state of hunger, energy, and fat utilization. And apple cider vinegar contributes to this by slowing digestion, smoothing glucose absorption, and creating a more gradual hormonal response to food intake that supports sustained energy balance throughout the day as meals are processed more steadily and metabolic stress is reduced across repeated eating